Hi, I'm Eleanor.
And I'm Lisa.
And we are here today to talk to you about the 5 stages of grief.
Yes, and you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief, I'm guessing. Most people, if they know anything about grief at all, they know about the 5 stages of grief. And there's sort of good news and bad news about that. The good news is we love that there is a conversation that happens about grief, that there is something that people can point to and talk about and reference when they're thinking about grief. But one of the things that we also know is that often when people know about the 5 stages of grief, they only know sort of the soundbite version.
Right.
They very quickly know that there are 5 stages. They maybe know what the 5 stages are. But there's actually a lot of complexity to the 5 stages of grief. So today we wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about the 5 stages and talking about why there have been some challenges for people understanding and applying the 5 stages.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, it seems that popular society loves the 5 stages of grief, whereas people who work in the death and dying field don't always embrace this grief theory as much as the wider general public. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I think that the 5 stages get a bad rap, mostly because they are misapplied.
Yes.
And also because they were founded a long, long time ago, and we've made a lot of progress since then. It's important for people to know when we talk about grief theory, which we do on our channel every once in a while, that there are many grief theories.
Yes.
The 5 stages of grief is just one of many other theories, and there is no one perfect model that is going to encapsulate anyone's grief. So everybody's grief is unique and individual, and these models just help us to think about and to talk about grief, and many times you're going to take the stuff that works and leave the stuff that doesn't.
Exactly. And so today we want to think about, with the 5 stages, what are the most important things to know? We're not going to be able to tell you every nuance of the 5 stages, but what are some of the important things to keep in mind when we say that sometimes it's misunderstood or that it's misapplied? What do you need to know about it? And then that, we hope, will let you think about what do you want to keep from this theory and what do you maybe want to leave behind that isn't so helpful for you.
First, I think we should probably start with a little background.
Yes.
So the 5 stages of grief were first put forth by Elisabeth Kubler Ross. And we really have her to thank for a lot of the progress that we've made in looking at grief and talking about grief in our broader society. So we owe a lot to Elisabeth Kubler Ross for her work. She originally, when she talked about the 5 stages of grief, was not looking at grieving individuals, interestingly enough. So when she first described the 5 stages of grief, she was really looking at people who are experiencing terminal illness. And so these different stages she used to describe the different stages that a person who's facing their own death, the things that they go through. And it wasn't until later when she wrote on grief and grieving here, Elisabeth Kubler Ross, and with David Kessler, who is a grief friend of ours, that she really started to apply these 5 stages to people who are actually grieving the death of a loved one.
Yes, and in doing so, she really was very clear to make a lot of caveats in talking about it. Obviously, On Death and Dying was a full book, On Grief and Grieving, full book. So to simplify it down to 5 stages really doesn't do justice to the nuance that is actually in her work. But just to go over the 5 stages so we remember what they are collectively. So stage 1, denial. Stage 2, anger. Stage 3, bargaining. Stage 4, depression. And stage 5, acceptance. So I think one of the reasons to start off that Elisabeth Kubler Ross's model was really appealing to people is that even though there is this wonderful, complex, and in-depth book about it, that it does kind of pack down nicely and neatly, and it makes us feel like, okay, grief is manageable. Like grief is, this absolutely devastating, earth-shattering event. But if somebody can tell me about these 5 stages I'll go through and I'll get to acceptance and whatever, it makes me feel like, okay, I can handle this. Maybe it'll be okay.
Yes, because grief is really scary. And when somebody who's really important dies, the future becomes unknown. And when the future is unknown, what do we want? We want answers. We want a roadmap. So we get why the 5 stages are so appealing to people and why everybody applies the 5 stages to things from the death of a loved one to things like stock market trends.
Yes,
So we get it. The tricky thing is there are a lot of different nuances to the 5 stages of grief that people just don't understand.
Yes, absolutely. So I think we're not going to go through all of them, but we want to talk about some important things. And I think probably the first one that is good to mention is that Elisabeth Kubler Ross never intended people to think that her theory was linear and that it was sort of finite, that it was going to end and we were going to go through stages, never repeat a stage, get to the end and be done with our grief. Quite the opposite. Elisabeth Kubler Ross actually gives us a lot of space and explanation to understand that we may bounce back and forth between stages, we may skip stages, we may never experience certain stages, and that we may come back time and again through this cycle. It's not something where we're going to reach the end and feel like we've tied up our grief in a nice, neat little bow and move forward, but that there's a lot more complexity, and that these stages just give us sort of a framework to understand some things that we may experience, and we may experience multiple times in multiple ways.
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions you just mentioned is that people think that these 5 stages are going to be linear. So they think that we will all naturally progress through these 5 stages from denial all the way to acceptance. And so that's why your next door neighbor might say to you, I think that you've moved into the anger phase, right?
Which only makes you really angry when they say it.
Yes, and that is not what was intended. So as Lisa mentioned, they said that stages can repeat. We might never experience a certain stage. We might move into a new stage and then move backward to another stage. So there isn't this nice, neat little progression where you go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4 to step 5.
Absolutely. And there is not, and I think one of the things that also doesn't really get explained or talked about enough is that there's not an assumed universality to this in the way that people often assume there is. It wasn't the intention to say every single person is going to experience this and do it in the same way and in the same time. And so oftentimes we hear the criticism from people that this really tries to create a cookie cutter approach to grief. It really doesn't account for all of the nuance that's there. And I think that in an oversimplified form, that's absolutely true. But we do know that there wasn't an intention to say this is universally applicable across the board.
Sure. And this doesn't describe every single thing that a person experiences when they're experiencing grief.
Correct.
So there are many other things that people experience beyond anger, depression, and things like that. Things like yearning, guilt, regret, even feelings of relief, growth, strength. So there are so many things that people experience when they're grieving, and they never intended to say this is a complete list of what. Wouldn't that be nice if grief were just 5 things?
5 things. And, you know, we were recently lucky to get to go to a training and sit down and have dinner with David Kessler, who was the co-author of this book. And one of the things that he, I think, says time and again is if everyone would read page 7 of this book, that some of these oversimplifications would probably be avoided. So in that spirit, don't worry guys, page 7 is really short. I'm going to do a quick one-over of it for you because I think it really emphasizes, this is absolutely the first page of this book, emphasizing what they want people to know is not necessarily true about the 5 stages. So they say, the 5 stages have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss. There is no typical loss. Our grief is as individual as our lives. The 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with the one we lost. They are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they are not steps on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or goes in a prescribed order. Our hope is that with these stages comes the knowledge of grief's terrain, making us better equipped to cope with life and loss.
Right, yes. And speaking of David Kessler, I think one last point that we should make is that because they end the stages with acceptance. There seems to be a misconception that there is an end point to grief, and that end point is a point of acceptance, whatever that means to you. May be different than what was intended by the book, but something important to note is that since publishing the 5 stages, if you ever get the chance to read a little bit more from David Kessler, maybe watch some videos on YouTube or even go to a training of his, he talks about another stage beyond that, and that is meaning, making meaning.
And I think that this is something that resonates a lot with people who are grieving. And again, he's still quick to say, not everyone grieving may experience this, but he does say that many people do find ways to make meaning out of that loss and to experience some form of their lives, of meaning in their lives after loss. And that this is a really important part of our thinking about where grief takes us as we move forward. So what meaning looks like is really different for different people, but I think it's important to remember that he accounts for that, and that there's a lot of ways that that might be applicable to your grief experience.
So that is all we have to say about the 5 stages of grief today. If you have questions, feel free to comment below. Again, it's really important for everybody to note that the 5 stages of grief is just one grief theory.
Yes.
We will talk about other grief theories in other videos, and you can watch those and compare and contrast how you think that they are similar and different, and which ones you think might apply the most to whatever you're experiencing.
Absolutely.